September 2024. A carefully worded press release from the U.S. Treasury Department announces a six-month
Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to address the critical economic indicators that have
license,
emerged in our
allowing
latest
Chevron
analysis.
to resume limited operations in Venezuela. The same week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivers a speech calling
Ladies
Nicolás
and gentlemen, I
Maduro's
stand
regime
before you today
a
to
threat to
address a matter of
democracy and
critical
regional
importance.
stability. On camera, the message is clear. Venezuela is a pariah state. Behind closed doors, American executives are booking flights to Caracas. This is not a contradiction. This is a pattern. For 25 years, the United States has maintained an obsession with Venezuela that defies simple explanation. We've imposed sanctions that devastated an entire economy. We've recognized opposition leaders as presidents. We've frozen billions in assets, indicted sitting officials, and placed bounties on their heads. And yet, when oil prices spiked in 2022, we quietly sent delegations to negotiate. When migration surged in 2023, we eased restrictions. When China made moves in 2024, we reconsidered our entire approach. Ask any analyst why the U.S. can't let Venezuela go, and you'll hear the familiar answers. The oil, the drugs, the dictatorship, the refugees. These explanations are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Because if you look at the numbers, Venezuela produces less than 2% of global GDP. Its oil infrastructure is a rusting monument to mismanagement. Colombia traffics more cocaine. Saudi Arabia is more authoritarian. Syria has created more refugees. And yet Venezuela receives a level of strategic attention reserved for threats that fundamentally challenge American power. So what's really happening here? What is it about this one country on the northern edge of South America that has consumed the attention of 4 consecutive U.S. administrations? Why have we spent political capital, economic leverage, and diplomatic credibility on a problem that, on the surface, seems manageable through simple containment? The answer is not on the surface. The answer requires us to see Venezuela not as a problem in itself, but as a symptom of something larger. A test case, a line in the sand, a question that, if answered wrong, reshapes the entire architecture of American power in the 21st century. What if Venezuela isn't the problem? What if Venezuela is the battleground where we're deciding whether the United States still controls its own hemisphere, or whether that era is already over? Let's start with what we're told. The standard explanation for U.S. policy toward Venezuela rests on 4 pillars, and on the surface, each one seems reasonable enough. First, the oil. Venezuela sits atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 304 billion barrels, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. For decades, this made Venezuela strategically crucial to U.S. energy security. But here's what doesn't add up. The United States now produces over 13 million barrels of oil per day, making it the world's largest producer. We're a net exporter of petroleum. Venezuela's collapsed infrastructure means it's producing less than 800,000 barrels daily, down from 3.5 million in the 1990s. If this were purely about oil, we'd simply buy from literally dozens of other suppliers who would welcome our business. Second, the drugs. We're told Venezuela has become a narco state with trafficking routes running from Colombia through Venezuelan territory to the Caribbean and beyond. The DEA estimates that hundreds of tons of cocaine transit through Venezuela annually, but Colombia, our close ally, is the source of 90% of cocaine entering the United States. Yet we provide them with billions in aid and maintain extensive cooperation. If drugs were the primary concern, the policy would be inverted. Third, the authoritarian regime. Maduro runs a repressive government that has jailed opponents, rigged elections, and overseen economic collapse. This is documented and undeniable. But the United States maintains close relationships with Egypt, where Sisi came to power through a military coup. With Saudi Arabia, where there are no elections at all, with Vietnam still governed by a communist party, we don't impose crippling sanctions on these nations. We sell them weapons. Fourth, regional stability and migration. The Venezuelan collapse has indeed created a humanitarian catastrophe, with 7.7 million people fleeing the country. But our sanctions accelerated this collapse, and the migration crisis they created now reaches our own southern border. Each explanation contains truth, but none of them, individually or collectively, explain the intensity, duration, and strategic focus that Venezuela receives. There's something else, something deeper, something we need to go back in time to understand. To understand why the United States cannot tolerate what's happening in Venezuela, you need to go back exactly 2 centuries to a document that still shapes American foreign policy, whether we admit it or not. December 2nd, 1823. President James Monroe delivers his annual address to Congress and announces a doctrine that will define hemispheric relations for the next 200 years. The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. The message was clear. The Western Hemisphere belongs to the United States. Any European intervention would be considered an act of aggression. This wasn't just rhetoric. Throughout the 20th century, the United States intervened repeatedly to enforce this principle. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup in Guatemala to remove a democratically elected president whose land reforms threatened United Fruit Company. In 1961, we invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs and spent decades trying to overthrow Castro. In 1973, we supported the military coup that toppled Salvador Allende in Chile. In 1983, we invaded Grenada, an island nation of 100,000 people, because a Marxist government had taken power. In 1989, we invaded Panama and arrested its leader, Manuel Noriega, bringing him to trial in the United States. The pattern is unmistakable. For 2 centuries, the United States has operated under a simple principle. No rival power will gain a strategic foothold in our hemisphere. Not military, not economic, not ideological. Then came the 1990s and the unipolar moment. The Soviet Union collapsed. Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. The Washington Consensus promoted free markets and democracy across Latin America. For a brief window, it seemed the Monroe Doctrine was unnecessary because there were no rivals left to exclude. American dominance was so complete it didn't need to be enforced. And then, on December 6, 1998, a former paratroop lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chavez won the Venezuelan presidency in a landslide. This was not supposed to happen. Venezuela had been one of the most stable democracies in Latin America. It was an OPEC founder, a reliable oil supplier, and a close U.S. ally. American oil companies operated freely there. The economic and political elite sent their children to universities in the United States. Chavez changed everything, and he did it deliberately.
Upon taking office, he rewrote the Constitution, extending presidential terms and consolidating power. But his real project was international. Chavez understood something that Washington had forgotten in its moment of triumph. Geography matters more than ideology, and Venezuela's geography gave him options. He looked at a map and saw what the United States had always known. Venezuela controls the approaches to the Caribbean. It borders Colombia, the linchpin of U.S. strategy in South America, and Brazil, the regional giant. It has access to both the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Any power that controls Venezuela can project influence across the entire northern tier of South America and throughout the Caribbean basin. So Ciaves built an anti-American coalition with systematic precision. He sent 100,000 barrels of oil per day to Cuba, keeping the Castro regime alive at a time when it was on the brink of collapse. In exchange, Cuba provided intelligence operatives who helped Ciaves restructure Venezuela's security services, embedding them so deeply that they're still there today. He created Petrocaribe, subsidizing oil for 17 Caribbean nations, buying influence and votes in international forums. He founded ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance, binding together left-wing governments in Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and several Caribbean states. But Ciaves didn't stop at the hemisphere. He traveled to Baghdad to embrace Saddam Hussein, breaking the international isolation of Iraq. He invited Mohammad Ahmadinejad to Caracas, forging a strategic partnership with Iran that included direct flights, industrial cooperation, and suspected military coordination. He bought billions of dollars in weapons from Russia, Sukhoi fighter jets, attack helicopters, Kalashnikov rifles, replacing the American hardware that had equipped Venezuela's military for decades. He opened the door to China, offering oil contracts and investment opportunities that Beijing had been seeking throughout Latin America. Venezuela became something the United States had not seen in its hemisphere since Cuba, a platform for rival powers. Russian military advisors arrived. Chinese oil workers came by the thousands. Iranian technicians helped develop industries. Cuban intelligence agents trained security forces. And through it all, sea-haves gave speeches at the United Nations calling George W. Bush the devil, claiming he could still smell the sulfur. He nationalized foreign oil companies.